Welcome to SC4 Crochet on YouTube. I'm Sharita, and today's crochet tutorial will be on the crocodile stitch. Don't let the length of this video scare you off. The tutorial is only about 10 minutes, but I'm going to go over some other variants for how to work this stitch, and I've included some minute markers in the description box so that you can skip ahead if you'd like to. Before we get into the tutorial, I wanted to share some basics about this stitch. The crocodile stitch is actually 2 rows. So the first row is going to be a row of V stitches. You actually stitch over top of those V stitches in order to create your scale. So it actually ends up being like you're working one row twice on top of each other. Now the scales, it takes a lot of stitches to make those. So this is a yarn eater. Another thing about this pattern is that as you go and build up, your scales are going to offset in between each other. So that's how you get that overlapping effect. It creates a very detailed stitch, and you can find some really great things to do with this. So let's grab our hooks and get into the tutorial. Starting with our slip stitch on our hook, we're going to chain a multiple of 6. So for this demonstration, I'm going to do a total of 24 chains. At the end of my 24 chains, or whatever your multiple of 6 is, we're going to chain another 4 chains, and then we're going to double crochet into the 4th chain. So we basically made a chain 3 that we're going to count as a double crochet, and another double crochet in the same stitch, and that counts as our first V stitch. You're going to chain 1 and then skip 2 stitches, and in that 3rd stitch, you're going to put 2 double crochets. So 2 double crochets are going to count as your V stitch. And you're going to continue this sequence around where you just chain 1, skip 2 stitches, and then place 2 double crochets into the 3rd stitch to make your V stitch. So as I make my way down my chain, my first chain should actually be where my last set of double crochets go for my final V stitch. Okay, and if you count this over, it is important that if you're doing a straight panel of crocodile stitches, that you end up with an odd number of V stitches. So in my case, I end up with 9. And that's because of the extra set of V's that we worked on the end of our chain. To make our crocodile scales, we want to rotate our work first so that it's vertical. Now I'm going to chain up 3, and that counts as my first double crochet. Now I'm going to do another 4 double crochets around the first post of my first V stitch. So this ends up being a total of 5 double crochets, and that's the first half of my scale. I'm going to chain 1 and then rotate my work again so that I'm looking at the other leg of that V stitch. And now I'm going to do 5 double crochets around that leg to complete my scale. Now, just as a pointer to control your work, it's really good to pinch that V stitch up so that you can make sure you're going into the right space. But this is what our first crocodile scale looks like. Now, to complete the rest of your scales, you're going to chain 1 in between your scales. And then you want to rotate your work again so that we're looking back at the side of those V stitches. Now, I'm going to skip one of the V stitches and go into the next one. And that's where I start my next set of scales. So, of course, we remember the pattern for the scales is 5 double crochets over the first leg of your V stitch. You're going to chain 1. Rotate your work, and then do 5 double crochets over the second leg of that V stitch, pinching that V-stitch so that you can make sure you're going into the right space. So we see our scales beginning to form. We're just So now that we're getting to the end of our row, we can see the importance of that extra set of V's that we worked at the end. So when we do our multiple of 6, that is actually considered 2 sets of V stitches. So one of those V's is for the scale, the other one is being skipped. And so if we are doing a straight panel of crocodile stitches, we don't want to have this skip stitch on the end. We want to start with a scale and end with a scale, and that's why we had the odd number of V stitches on our first row. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not to say that this pattern won't work out if you don't have the odd number of V stitches to start. It's just going to look a little different because you'll have an empty space on the end. So we're just trying to achieve some symmetry here. And now you can see what the back looks like as well. You could clearly see those V's are visible on the back, and you can see our skip spaces in between. So this is just showing you what it should look like when you're done with your first one. It might look a little weird, but there's some shaping involved that's going to help this to work out. So on our next row, we're doing another row of V stitches. So I'm going to chain 3, and then I'm going to put my double crochet. Instead of in the same space, we're going into the middle of the scale. Now it looks a little weird, but that's still considered your first V-stitch space. Then I'm going to chain 1, and I'm going to V-stitch into the V-stitch that we skipped from the previous row, but I want to go over top of that chain 1 space that I created in between my scales. So our next V-stitch is pinning down that chain 1 space. Then we're going to chain 1 and V-stitch in the middle of the scale, chain 1 and V-stitch into our skipped V, but over top of that chain 1 space. Chain 1 again, V-stitch in the middle, chain 1, V-stitch in our skipped V. And then of course, as we continue that sequence all the way down to the end, we're going to end up with our final scale. And we're just going to put our last V-stitch right into the middle, so you don't have to copy what you did on the first where you tack it down to the end. Now starting our next row of scales, we want to remember that we don't want to scale right on top of the other scale. We want the scales to fall in between each other. So we're going to rotate our work, and I'm going to chain 1 in order to kind of pull up my work. But I'm going to go directly into the next V-stitch, not the one that I just came out of. And I'm going to start my 5 double crochets on that one in order to make my next scale. And then of course, chain 1 and then rotate your work and do your next 5 double crochets to finish off that scale. Okay, we're going to continue the same pattern of scaling that we did before. You're going to chain 1, skip a V, and then do a scale into the next V. And you should see that as you work this second row, all of your scales should be lining up in between your previous scales. So you're kind of matching up with the V-stitch that you skipped on your previous row. Now this one ends up being our last scale for this row. And when we're done and we kind of lay it out, you can see that there's less scales on this row than it was in the previous row. And that's because of the fact that we've offset our scales so that they're like set in between. So I only did 4 on this row, whereas on the previous row I had 5. Now, of course, you are going to kind of shape your scales a little bit to make sure that they lay right. But that's pretty much what your second row looks like. And then to finish it off, you're going to take that ending piece. In order to tack that down, you're going to slip stitch into that funny space that we created, that first V space. You're just going to slip stitch into it to tack that down. So now we're working into a row of V stitches, and we're going to put our first V stitch right into that same space. Now, remember, this is a good point to keep in mind. When you do your V stitches, you're never skipping a space. So you should be putting a V stitch into every V stitch of the previous row. The only time you're skipping a space is when you're actually doing a scale. All right, and then you just want to remember that as you work your V's along this row, you want to make sure that you are tacking down that chain 1 space in between your scales, because that's going to help with the shaping. And then when you make your way to the end of it, just make your last V stitch into the V stitch from your previous row. You don't have to tack it into your last scale because it's all going to line up as they cascade. And then when I start this next row, I'm just chaining 3 and then doing my 4 double crochets to start the scale on the end, just like I did before. And you just continue the sequence. This is what it looks like when you have a couple rows done. So now let's get into our first variation. We're going to do our crocodile stitch in the round now, and we are starting exactly like we did before. So I'm going to chain a multiple of 6, but in this case, we don't have to put the extra V stitch on the end. We're just going to take our multiple of 6, which I did 24, and I am just going to slip stitch into the first chain in order to join my round. From here, we're going to chain up 3, and then we're going to do a double crochet into that same stitch, and that's going to make our first V stitch. Now we want to continue our pattern for our V stitches. So you're going to chain 1, skip 2 stitches, and then do 2 double crochets into the 3rd stitch to make a V stitch. And then continue to chain 1, skip 2, and then V stitch. When we were working on the flat version of the crocodile stitch, you remember we ended with a V stitch, but in this case, we're ending with the space. So we're just going to chain 1 and then slip stitch into the top of that first chain 3 that we did in order to join our round. If you count your V's, you'll end up with an even number of V stitches on this one, which makes sense because it's going to line up symmetrically where you'll have that space in between your crocodile scales. So let's start scaling. We're going to chain 1, and instead of working into the first V that we created, we're going to work backwards into the last V we created. And we're just going to make 5 double crochets over the first leg of that V stitch. You're going to chain 1, rotate your work, and do 5 double crochets over the second leg of that V stitch. And that's how you create your first scale, just like we did before. You're going to chain 1, skip a V, and work into your next V to make your next scale. Again, 5 double crochets, chain 1, rotate your work, do 5 double crochets over the other part of the V stitch. And then just continue your pattern of chaining 1, skipping a V, and then scaling over the next V until you make your way to the end of the row. Once we're done with our final scale, we are going to slip stitch into the last V-stitch in order to end that row. So you can see that in the round, we ended up with only 4 scales on our first row instead of 5, just because we didn't put that extra V-stitch on the end. All right, to make our next set of V-stitches, we're going to start right in that same space by chaining up 3 and then double crocheting in the same space. You're going to chain 1 and V-stitch in the middle of your scale, chain 1 and V-stitch into the V-stitch that you skipped, but make sure you go over the chain 1 space that you created in your scales. All right, and just repeat that same pattern of V-stitching around and chaining 1 in between your V's until you get to the end. And then you are going to slip stitch into the top of that first chain 3 that you created. And that's how you join that row to finish it off. Now we want our second row of scales to fall in between the first row. So I'm going to make my first scale on this same V-stitch that I just stitched into. I chained 1 and did 5 double crochets on the side. I probably should have chained 3 and did 4 double crochets on the side. You can see that my first scale looks a little rounded at the top, but whichever way works best for you. Chain 1, rotate your work, and then do the other 5 double crochets to finish off that scale. Chain 1, skip a V-stitch, and then scale into your next V-stitch. Your scales should be lining up in between the scales from the previous row and on top of the V-stitches that you skipped from the previous row. So you just want to continue this sequence all the way around to the end of your row. As you finish your last scale, you're going to slip stitch into the next V-stitch in order to finish that row. Now I noticed that pinned down the end of my last scale, but I noticed that my first scale was still flapping a little bit too. So as an alternative, I actually stuck my hook into the last stitch of my first scale and actually slip stitched into both of them to finish off that row so that I can just tack both of those down. So as you can see, when you're working in the round, you end up with the same number of scales on each row. They just cascade in between each other. And also because of that, there's no variance from row to row when you work this pattern in the round. So you're going to repeat exactly what you just did for row 2 as far as the way you chain up in order to get to your V-stitches. And then also the way when you create your first scale, you're going to be creating it on the V-stitch that you just chained into. So it works out the exact same way for your following rows. So of course my demo piece is a little small, but you can see what it looks like in the round after a few rows. I do have an upcoming project where we will be working with the crocodile stitch in the round, so you'll be able to see it in a way that it's a lot more practical. As I incorporated the crocodile stitch into my crochet projects, I started to notice a couple of problems with this stitch. The first problem we run into is that the scales like to curl. So you've seen me throughout the video kind of flipping the scales a little bit to try to make them lay flat. Of course, you can block your project, that is an option. But I'm going to show you another alternative to kind of tack down the tip of the scale in order to keep it from curling up. So here I've already completed my first row of scales the regular way, and of course I can't tack them down, it's the first row. But on my second row, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin down the tip of my scale by connecting that with a slip stitch to the scales from the previous row. So where I want to tack it down is I want to find the third double crochet of each of those scales. So you just count down 3, slip your hook into the space and slip stitch, and then you're going to do your normal chain 1 that you would do in between your scale and finish the 5 double crochets. So you can see that I tacked that scale down so it creates a point on the end and it keeps it from curling up. So let's do it again. I already chained 1, I'm skipping a V, and I'm going to start my scale into my next V stitch. I did my 5 stitches, and now I'm going to count up to the third double crochet from each of these scales, slip my hook into it and slip stitch, chain 1, and then finish off my scale for that row. So as I repeat that sequence all the way to the end of my row, I'm going to finish this one off with the slip stitch as normal. And you can see what it looks like with my scales pinned down. So comparing row 2 to row 1, you can see that row 1 is still curling up because that's the first row, but the second row is pinned down. And then as I do my next row of V stitches, you can see that it really pins those scales down flat. Now starting this next row of scales is a little bit different because you can see that you only have 1 scale on the row below it to tack into, but you follow the same exact process. After you do your 5 double crochets, you are just going to find the third double crochet of the scale below it, slip stitch into it, and then continue with your chain 1 and finishing off your scale. So that's the only difference with the offset rows. You just want to remember that your first and your last scale may only have 1 scale to pin down to, but you're still going to do the same pinning process all the way across. And after a few rows, you can see we have a much flatter look to our scales. Now, as you work up a couple more rows, though, you see that the appearance of the pattern does change. When you're tacking it down, it almost creates this line work that kind of takes away from the scaly appearance. So keep that in mind. Even though these scales do curl, when you look at the overall look of your project, that is part of the nature of this pattern, and it actually highlights the scaly appearance. So I had another thought to kind of make the scales more pointy on the end to combat the curliness without having to tack them down. So here I'm starting my same scale with the 5 double crochets, but instead of chaining 1 at the end, I'm going to chain 3. And then I'm going to slip stitch right back into the 2 legs of that double crochet. You can see those there. We're just going to slip stitch into it. And that's how you make a picot stitch. So instead of chaining 1, I picoted. And now I'm going to finish off my scale with my double crochets. And now instead of my rounded scale, I end up with a scale with a point on the end, almost like a leaf would look. And now I'm just going to continue with my scales, chaining 1, doing my 5 double crochets. And then here's that picot again. We chain 3, we find those 2 bars from our double crochet and slip stitch into them. And that's how you finish off that picot tip. And then just go right back into your 5 double crochets to complete your scale. So this is how my picot scales look at the end of that row. You can see they still are curling just like our original stitch. It's just that you have a little bit more of a point on the end of them. And here's how we look after 4 rows doing that picot stitch. So you can really see the difference now. Even though the pattern is still curling up, it's curling up with that pointed tip. And so you're still getting the scaly effect, and it doesn't look like it's lifting up as much as it did when we were dealing with the regular crocodile stitch. It's definitely a little bit more work with putting that picot on the end, but you can see it makes a difference in the look of the pattern. So here you can see all three versions kind of next to each other, so you can weigh that out and decide which one works best for your project. I wanted to address one more problem with the crocodile stitch, and that is spaces. Now that's not always going to be a problem with your project depending on what type of item you're making. But if I'm using this to make a garment, there are a lot of holes in this project because of that whole V-stitch row. There's a lot of spaces in between our stitches and in between our scales. So even though the scales overlap, they can easily lift up or curl, and you can see straight through these gaping holes between our V-stitches. Now, even though that tack down method changes the look of the stitches, that is one of the benefits of that method, is that because you're tacking down the tip of each of those scales, you're eliminating some of the spacing. It doesn't lift up the same way, so you're not going to have as much exposure in between your stitches. So the way I'm fixing the spacing issue is I'm going to do a base row of double crochets instead of doing the V-stitch. Now, I was supposed to be starting with a chain of 24 just like I did before, but I inadvertently ended up doing 18 stitches instead. And if you've watched any of my previous videos, you know I'm not a fan of chaining, so I was really tempted to do a foundation double crochet row, but just for consistency, I'm going to stick with the chain. And just like we did on the first method, I'm going to chain 4 at the end of my chain and double crochet into that 4th chain in order to create my first set of V-stitches. But we're double crocheting, not V-stitching. So we're going to put a double crochet in each of the remaining chains. In this case, there's 18 more double crochet. Now try not to think too hard about that V-stitch that we just created on the end. Remember the logic behind the original pattern. We still have to put that extra set on the end in order to end up with an odd number of scales. So it's all going to come together when we start scaling. So when it's time to scale, I'm going to treat these double crochets the same way I treated my V-stitch. So I'm going to look at the first 2 double crochets like a V-stitch. I start with my chain 3, which counts as my first double crochet, and then I do my 4 double crochets around that first double crochet. Chain 1, rotate my work, and pinch that second double crochet because I'm treating that like a V. Now it's important to pinch on this one because you don't want to grab the double crochet that's next to it. So you just want to complete those double crochets around to complete your scale and chain 1. Now when it comes time to make your next scale, you're going to skip 4 stitches. You grab your 5th stitch, and this is just like your V. So you're going to do your 5 double crochets around it. Chain 1, grab the 6th stitch, pull it up, and do your 5 double crochets around it. So if you think about it, this works exactly like it does on the original pattern. The logic is every 6 stitches is going to give you a scale and the spacing that you need between your next scale. So I'm just repeating that, but I'm looking at the double crochets as being 6 double crochets, being 2 for my scale and 4 for my space. And so of course, as I make my way to the end of the row, you can see I have 4 stitches, 4 double crochets remaining to skip. And that V-stitch that I put on the end is exactly where I want to put my last scale. So even though my stitch count is off from my original pattern, so I don't end up with the same number of scales, you still see the same concept where I end up with a scale at the beginning of my row and a scale at the end of my row instead of a space. So as I work into my next row, which is a row of double crochets, I want to keep that 6 count in mind. So if you flip the scales back, you can see that the double crochets from the previous row are clearly exposed, and you can see a clear 4 count of double crochets underneath those scales. Okay, so we know that if we have 4 double crochets that are skipped, then the 5th and 6th double crochets are the ones that my scale is on top of. So I just chained 3. That's going to count as my first stitch. My second stitch is going to go right there in the center of my scale. So that's 2 of my 6. And now I'm just going to put double crochets in these 4 that are exposed. But I want to make sure I'm doing just like I did before, where I'm grabbing that chain that's in between my scales and making sure that I tack that down as I go across. So I grabbed that on the 5th stitch, and then I did my 6th. Now coming back around for the count, we know that the first stitch is the one that the scale is going into, and the second stitch is in the middle of the scale. And now we're going to have 3 and 4. 5 is where we're going to grab our chain space. And then 6 is open as well. And that's how I'm keeping count. 1 is the first part of the scale. 2 is in the middle of the scale. 3 and 4 are exposed. 5, we're grabbing our chain space. And then 6 is the last exposed space. Also wanted to point out how these stitches kind of raise up a little bit. That's going to be important as we come back along this row. Now, if you count these double crochets with me, I end up with a 20 count. So that's 18, which is my multiple of 6, plus the 2 extra that I put on the end to make sure that I ended with a scale on my first row. Now I'm putting this double crochet at the end right there just as a demonstration to show you what it would be like if you were inserting these crocodile stitches as an accent on a bigger project that maybe was made out of double crochets. I don't know, maybe I'm heading towards my next project. If I get that uploaded, I'll have that linked here too so you can see how that will look. Remember those lifting stitches I was showing you before? That's how you know where to start your next scale. So just remembering that your scales are going to start in between your other scales, right where you lift it up, in order to make that 6th stitch that goes in between the V's. That's how you know where you're supposed to be making your next scale. So of course you can just count over, make sure that you're skipping the 4 and pick up on that next stitch. But as you do your count, you'll see that that's where it lines up, because right where you put in that stitch in the middle of the V's, it just causes the stitch to lift up for you. All right, so of course this patch is some short rows, so I just finished that off, and I'm going to slip stitch as I normally would in order to get back to the next row. So I started to lose daylight and my camera didn't want to focus, so I'm going to skip ahead and show you what it looks like after a few rows are complete. So this is our swatch with 4 rows complete, just to match that up with the first swatch that we made with the traditional method. To me, it looks like the scales seem to be like a little closer together, like maybe they're not curling as much. I don't know if that's really what's happening, but you really see the difference when you look at the back side. So we see lots of spaces through the back side of the original version, whereas on this one, you only really see the spaces in the middle of these scales. So that can make a definite difference if you're making a garment or some type of wearable piece. I hope you guys have learned some new things about the crocodile stitch and you're inspired to create some new projects with it. I know I'll be back with some new tutorials using the stitch, so make sure you hit the subscribe button with the notification bell so you can get the alerts for that. And also like the video. Thanks again for watching.